Welcome to the Confessing Baptist podcast and video. This is we're burgeoning on the video world and trying to expand in the audience that we reach. So, but this is also going to be on audio, from what Jason Delgado tells me. So, my name is Billy Linhart, and I'm new to the Confessing Baptist podcast. But today we have with us Pastor Larry Vincent of Grace Baptist, Heritage Baptist Church in Mansfield, Texas. Mm-hmm. And remind me again, it's David Dykstra, and what church do you pastor in
Grace Covenant Baptist Church in Willis, Texas.
That's
about
great.
An hour north of Houston.
Well, good, yeah. And what we do, what typically we do in the Confessing Baptist podcast, you guys are new to it, so what we do for anybody who's new is we ask 3 questions. We ask, how did you become a Christian? How did you become Reformed? And how did you become a Baptist? And it doesn't have to necessarily be in that order. It's just in the order that God's providence worked in your life to bring you to those convictions. So we'll start with Pastor Larry. Okay. How is it that you became a Christian? How is it that you became Reformed? And how is it that you became Baptist?
Okay. Well, the Baptist part came along with the other two, so that's a little easier, I suppose. Came out of a family that was Christian influenced, but not a Christian family. When I was 15, I was invited to go to a youth camp at Falls Creek in Oklahoma by a church that was at the end of the street, and through some very interesting providences, I actually went. Of all people upon the earth, I probably despise Christian kids the most. But I went, and in God's great, kind providence, there was somebody preaching that week, and I don't even know who it was, but they were preaching on the law of God. And it was just what I needed to hear. I needed to know that it wasn't just all these various authorities in my life that I was quite rebellious against, but it was before my Creator and the one who I owed everything to. And so that week, under great conviction of sin, and somebody took me through Romans 10. I cried out and asked the Lord for forgiveness, and for me it was a very dramatic, very emotional experience and change of life. I don't think that's true for everybody, but it was for me, probably because I was pretty radical in some of my pursuits at that point in life. But I became a believer. It wasn't long before I began to express interest in the gospel ministry. I was encouraged. We moved away from Oklahoma a year later. I got involved with Independent Fundamental Baptist Church. Ended up going to one of their schools, Bob Jones University. Graduated from there in 1974. And even though it's not a Baptist school, I became more and more convinced of what I understood to be Baptist distinctives. But I was not ready to pursue the ministry, even though I had a degree in church administration. Eventually did go to grad school, never went to any kind of seminary work. But then I was called in the ministry when I was 32. I was married, had 3 children. And in my first pastorate, and I will freely admit that in looking back, I should not have been in the ministry. In some ways, I don't think I was really ready doctrinally for it. But I'm one of those people, and I've known others that have similar circumstances, that God used that to really move me along. Because when I got into the ministry, 2 things occurred to me that were, for me, very profound, and they probably should have been that way long before. But those 2 things were that no one on the face of this earth was responsible for what I was preaching, what was being preached in the pulpit of my church, except me. I was a sole pastor. And the other thing, the corollary to it, was no one was going to answer to God for my ministry but me. And that made me begin to study like I had never studied before. Just prior to going into the ministry, an old friend who I didn't even know was a Calvinist, had given me a stack of books. And in that stack of books was a book by Walt Chantry called Today's Gospel, Authentic or Synthetic. And it was the second time in my life that book had been given to me. And being a somewhat mystical fundamentalist in those days, I thought, this is a sign from God. I got to read this book. And it was the first thing I read, other than my commentaries and my work for preaching and teaching in the ministry. It was the first thing I read, and it really did turn my world upside down. I was convinced reading that book, which is an extended exposition of Matthew 19, and the Lord's dealing with the rich young ruler. I was convinced I was reading truth like I'd never read it and heard it before in my life. Now, this church that had hired me to come as their full-time preaching pastor had rejected a Calvinist who had candidated there right before me because he was a Calvinist. And within 2 years, I had fully embraced what we would call the 5 points of Calvinism or the doctrines of grace. And in that stack of books was also a confession, a 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith, and I began to study that. And it was about that time that I met Reformed Baptist men in Southern California. That's where I was as a pastor. And the rest is history. I mean, I began studying the confession. I was already convinced in the importance of preaching verse by verse through texts of Scripture. I had started Ephesians, and when I got to chapter 2, everything was being shed. That I had been taught about dispensationalism. My whole Arminian scheme of salvation was gone by then. And that, I could go on and on. There's a lot of books that influenced me and had effect on me, but that's basically the story.
So at your conversion and going into ministry initially, you were already Baptistic?
Yes.
And so did you ever evolve on that issue at all, or did you was it refined by any particular study that you did of Reformed doctrine or anything?
Well, in working with the confession and trying to read as many things as I could get a hold of in theology and systematic theology and getting good commentaries, you're exposed to the fact that you see, Presbyterian author after Presbyterian author. So there, I'm sure, we're going back quite a few years. I struggled at some point with some of those issues, but that was never really a profound concern for me. I was so convinced of the Baptist distinctive of regenerate church membership, as much as we can accomplish that, that nothing I read ever shook that. Yeah. And as long as I held on to that, then the mode of baptism issue was never a problem. So anyway, that's kind of the short answer to that.
Yeah, that's good. And for you, Dr. Dykstra?
Oh, it's not Dr.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just amazed at how many striking parallels there are between us on this. I too was converted through an invitation to a camp, and I was 16 at the time. Went to a camp in Upper New York State, and was dramatically converted at that camp. I'd grown up in a Paedo-Baptist denomination, a Reformed Church of America, which is a fairly liberal denomination, but the pastor I had was an evangelical man. But I wasn't converted under his ministry. I was converted at camp, and my conversion was like yours. It was a radical conversion. My pastor was the one who convinced me, because at the time, growing up in a working class neighborhood and parents, I didn't have the thought of going to college at the time. This was 1967. Without first going into the military and using the military to pay for my college. So my intention was to go into the Marine Corps at the time, and then after serving in the Marine Corps to come back and go to college. My pastor convinced me that, and of course at the time Vietnam was at its height and all the rest of that, so he didn't think that war was being fought the way a war should be fought. He thought war should be fought to win. And so he said, before you make up your mind on that, I'd like you to put in a year at a Bible college that I know of. So I went away to Northeastern Bible College in Essex Fells, New Jersey. And it's interesting because even in my pre-Christian days, I can see the hand of God in providence over me as far as public speaking went. Because for 4 years in high school, I was engaged in public speaking competitions. And I was pushed into that by my homeroom teacher, but even in my pre-Christian days, I was still developing in public speaking through my high school. So I'm at Northeastern in Essex Fells, about, 15 miles from New York City. And there's a Reformed Baptist church a quarter mile away, Trinity Baptist Church, pastored by Al Martin.
Oh, okay.
The school was a dispensational school, but in systematic theology, they used Berkhoff.
Oh, wow.
And so I became a Calvinist. And of course, I had grown up in a church under the Heidelberg Catechism. But Berkhoff really helped me when I was in school. And then through the influence of friends, they invited me to church at Trinity. And I started going. At the time, it was a small church meeting just, like I said, a quarter mile from campus. And that's what really solidified me in becoming a Reformed Baptist. And so I was first exposed to the 1689 through them. And it was from that church that after graduation, I accepted a call to a small country church in northwestern New Jersey in Sussex County. And I can remember clearly there on campus, I saw this little 3x5 card up on a bulletin board, wanted pulpit supply for small country church in Sussex County. And I thought, wow, I ought to check this out because I used to hunt and fish up there. And brought it to Al Martin and said, what do you think I should do about this? And he said, well, I think you should follow up on this. At the very least, you'll get experience in preaching. So I went, and I spent 36 years there.
Oh, wow. That was Lafayette.
It started out as Monroe Bible Chapel and then became the Reformed Baptist Church of Lafayette when we bought the new building back then. So I've been a Reformed Baptist since, I would say, since 1972.
And so you would have been 20? 21?
22.
Okay.
Too young.
Yeah.
Looking back on it now, but too young.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, it's interesting that both of y'all have that experience. You know, you saying that you were too young, and you saying that you weren't probably properly prepared for the ministry. Yeah. You know, I've had similar conversations with other pastors who say that that God had them wait for their first pastorate until maybe they were 40 years old, and looking back on it, as impatient as they were, they probably weren't as prepared as they should have been in those years that they were having to wait and probably being impatient. So, but God, as we see in all kinds of testimonies, God has His way of working things out for the better in all of those things. That's really.